Another way that you can add texture variation to your materials is by using image-based textures. So procedural textures are strong in the fact that since they are mathematically based, you can zoom in as far as you want and they will never break down. Image-based textures, however, are based off of pixels. So they are based off of a given resolution. And if you get too close, they'll start to look pixelated, just like if you take any image and you blow it up too big, you'll start to see the pixels. Now, the same thing is going to apply to textures. But where they lack the ability to zoom in infinitely, they make up for it. And the flip side is you can get much more fine-tuned control over the way that they actually apply to the surfaces, because you actually can get control at the pixel level, and you can even paint directly on top of image-based materials. So right here I've got a very simple example of an image-based texture. So this is just a default material, and then it has a wood slats image applied to the diffuse color, and then a wood slats bump, which is a grayscale but matching image applied to displacement. So you can see we actually get a little bit of surface displacement there. All right, so let's hop over and actually look at how we would create an image-based texture and talk about some of the differences between this and how we would use a procedural texture. Now, one thing to note though is that really they're doing the exact same thing. So image-based textures and procedural textures are really the same in the fact that they are adding modulation and variation to the surface of a material instead of just using a blank value. So instead of just having one color or one transparency value, you're adding variation to the surfaces. So I'm going to take this sphere here, and this is ball 2. And in my render preset browser here underneath, I've navigated to the images section. You can see there's a bunch of kind of built-in stuff that that just comes with Modo. Now you can get other image packs from all sorts of different places, and a lot of times they'll come in complete sets where they will have a diffuse color, a reflective color, a roughness value, a normal map, a bump map, all sorts of nice stuff like that. So usually they'll come in as a group so that you can apply them. Now we're just going to look at how these images apply here. So I'm going to let's look at the fabric section here. So we've got a folder just for fabric, and I've got a cloth section here. And you can see I've got a bunch of different cloths, and a lot of these have an accompanying bump map. So we'll actually put on a bump map as well so we can see how that works. So here you see we've got this kind of orangish colored burlap. All right. Now in order to put this in, all I have to really do is just drag and drop it into the shader tree, and it's going to apply just right to the surface of the model, and it's going to use the default application mode is a UV map. Now we're going to talk about UV maps in more depth in the next lesson, but basically what it is essentially a 2D representation of 3D space where you've taken your 3D models and flattened them out, and then the image will just lay over the top of that UV, and then that gets just wrapped around the surface in that way. Aside from that, there are other ways that you can apply images. So if I look over here, here's my burlap image. It's now in my shader tree. I've got my texture layer, which shows my image. I can also change the image to another one that I have in the scene. You have some basic controls over the image here, but then underneath this, in the next section down, we have a texture locator, and this is going to govern how the texture is applied to the surface. The default projection type is a UV map, but you see we have a number of other methods, and these are going to be the same kind of ones that we used with procedural textures, where we've got solid, which is just going to project straight through, and with an image that doesn't work very well. We have planar, so we can just project in one direction. Say I just want to project down the z-axis, it's going to get stretched as it is not facing the z. So here at the side and also at the top, but it's a little out of view, obviously it's just kind of stretching across the surface. We can choose cylindrical, spherical, which will probably work fairly well with this one. It's just going to wrap around. Let's make it wrap around the y-axis, which is the vertical axis. You can see there's our texture on the surface. Okay. You can also choose cubic, so it's going to project from all 6 directions, or box, which is a variation of cubic. You can do front projection, which is just basically taking a camera angle and it's projecting straight through that camera. UV map, and then these other ones are going to be for some other things that we'll look at a little bit later on. So I'm going to set this back to our default of UV map, and since there is a UV, this is just a default sphere. It's a primitive object. All the primitive objects will come with a basic UV map. Now we can create better UV maps for them, and then for other things where there isn't a UV map, we'd have to actually build them from scratch, which is what we'll look at in the next lesson. But you can see that since there is a UV map, this gets projected onto the surface. Now there are some controls that you get within the UV map. So adjusting the size up here is not going to work with the UV map. That will change if you're using one of the other projection methods, but it's not going to change this here. So I could put in other values here on the size, and it's not going to affect it because it's based off of UV space and not 3D space at this point. What I can do, however, is change the wrap and the offset. So if I turn off use clip UDIM, which is basically a multi-tiled UV map, we can choose to offset these. So if I take my U and I drag up the value here, we'll look and see that the texture kind of swims across the surface a little bit. So you can use that to get some offset. But really what we're looking for here is, since this texture is so large on the surface, is we want to use a wrap. So a wrap you can think of as the number of times a texture is going to tile across UV space. If you set this to values less than 1, it will make the texture larger. If you set it to numbers higher than 1, it will make the texture smaller. So I'm going to set my horizontal and vertical both to 3. Now you can see that my burlap gets a lot smaller in scale and actually looks a little bit more like something you'd expect. I'm going to go a little higher. Let's go up to 5. Yeah, there we go. That's looking a little bit more like something like a cloth on the surface. Now you have also controls over how these tiles repeat. You can choose to repeat them. You can have them reset, which is just going to go back to a blank value. You can have them mirror, so instead of just having tiles next to each other, you think about it, if you go left to right across the tile, as it hits the edge of the tile, the next tile is going to go, instead of left to right, is going to go right to left. So it's as if there's a mirror at the edge. And then you can also do the edge, which is going to take the value at the edge, whatever that pixel value is, and it's just going to stretch that off into infinity. Now we just want to repeat them because this is a repeating tiled texture, so it's just going to repeat across the surface. Okay, so there's our basic look at that. And now let's go ahead and add another layer here. So I'm going to take a bump map here, and I'm going to plug that into ball 2, just like the other one. And now to make this align with the other texture here, this diffuse color, what I want to do is I want to match up any changes that I've made. In this case, the only changes that I made were to the horizontal and vertical wrap, so I can just put in 5 and 5 here. And that's going to adjust that for me so that I can change that. Now, alternately, what I could do, let me go ahead and hide this for a second, is I could take this burlap image here, and I'm just going to create an instance of it. So create instance. And at first, it's just going to look just like the same texture on top of itself, which is the same texture. But what I can do here is I can go up to the texture layers, and I can change the image now to my burlap bump, since that's in there, and it's going to attach, and it's going to use all of the other values. So if I make any changes here to, I don't know, say the gamma, which will make it brighter or darker, or if I change the texture locator, this is automatically going to align to it because it's an instance. So the only thing that I've changed on the instance is the actual image that's being applied. So that's a quick way that you can do that. So let me go ahead and just let's delete that. And now if I change this, if I go down to surface shading and choose bump, now we're going to have just our orange texture, and then we're going to have the bump laying on top of it to give us the feel of, you know, a more depth on the surface. Okay, so using images is a really powerful way to add a lot of additional variation to the surface of your objects. You can also paint right on top of images if you have them in your scene. But one thing to remember is that if I take these images over here, you can see that I've got a tab here for images, and everything that I've got here is it's just stuff that I've taken out of the content. Now if I were to, say, paint something across the surface of this burlap, if I wanted to, you know, paint a logo on it or something, I wouldn't want to necessarily override just that basic burlap image that's in my content. So what I could do is, after I've made changes, you can go to the images tab here, and then I can right click and choose Save As, and then I can save that either back into my presets here, or I could save that into a project folder specific to this project so that I'm making changes to that version of the image. Now, one other thing to note is anytime you do make changes to an image and you go up and save your scene, so you'll File, Save, or Save As, that's not going to save your image, any painting that you've done to your image. So one thing that you have to remember is that if you do make changes to an image, you'll have to either choose Save Image As or Save Image if you've already done a Save As, or you can do that right here on the image to Save or Save As. Or the kind of the last way to do it is going to choose Save All, and that will save your file. It's going to save whatever the current version of your file is, and then it's going to save any images or anything else attached, and that way any changes that you've made will save along with the save file. So just a note, if you use Save or Save As, it will not by default save your images. So you want to make sure you either use Save All or you're saving your images manually that way. Okay, so that does it for the basics of images. Like I said, in a lot of ways they're very similar to procedural-based textures, just that we are using images so we can use photographic source, we can use stuff that we've painted in a 2D application, we can go in and make changes in a 2D application, or we can paint directly on them right here inside of Modo, but we're trading off the flexibility of scale, not being able to zoom infinitely far in, with the flexibility of being able to edit them on a very specific pixel-based level. So in the next lesson, we'll go on to look at how we can create our own UV maps or edit the UV maps that are already existing in order to get more control over how these images map to the surface of our objects. Thanks, and I'll see you in the next lesson.